Species. Unite.
Let's say that you eat meat and you're sitting down and you're biting into a juicy hamburger, and your dining companion turns to you and says, Elizabeth, that hamburger is actually not made from beef, it's made from golden retrievers.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. Dr. Melanie Joy is a psychologist, author, and the person who gave a name to something that most of us have been living with our whole lives without noticing. She coined the term Carnism, the invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals but not others. And her best-selling book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, has been asking people to question that conditioning for over a decade. In this conversation, we talk about how Carnism works, why even compassionate people resist the information, and what it actually takes to change, not just what we eat, but how we relate to each other and ourselves. It's a conversation that starts with food and ends with something much bigger. Melanie, welcome back. It's great to have you back.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
So we both can't remember when the last time you were on was, but I know it was years ago. Since it was so long ago, I think we need to kind of reintroduce you to our audience. So if you say a little bit about yourself, kind of who you are, what you do, and then we'll get into it.
I'm Dr. Melanie Joy. I am a psychologist. I am the author of 8 books. I'm best known for my best-selling book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. It's on the psychology of eating animals, which I know we'll be talking about today. I also have books on relationships and communication, and one in particular is for people who are vegan and non-vegan, vegan, vegetarian, and non-vegan in relationships or communicating with each other. I'm also the founding president of the nonprofit Beyond Carnism. A lot of my work really looks at how we can more effectively relate to other humans, other animals, ourselves, and the people in our lives so that we can create a better world for all of us.
So let's start with Carnism and what Carnism is. You coined the term.
To explain what Carnism is, it's useful to have to do a little bit of a thought experiment, right? So if you imagine, let's say that you eat meat and you're sitting down and you're biting into a juicy hamburger, and your dining companion turns to you and says, Elizabeth, that hamburger is actually not made from beef, it's made from golden retrievers. So take a moment to reflect on your thoughts and feelings. Chances are what you had just thought of as food, you now think of as a dead animal. What you had just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. And therefore, rather than continuing to eat the burger, you probably want to throw it away in the trash and maybe even take to the streets and protest. So that reaction that you had to the golden retriever burger, that is your authentic reaction. Your reaction to the idea of eating beef is the reaction that was conditioned by Carnism. So Carnism is the invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. It's basically the opposite of veganism. We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system, but the only reason we might eat pigs but not dogs, for example, is because we do have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. Because, when eating animals, when any behavior is not a necessity, then for survival, then it's a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs, but we just don't realize that when we eat animals, we're operating from a belief system because this belief system, Carnism, has remained invisible. And I could talk, if you want, a little bit about how I came to stumble on Carnism and kind of what led me there.
Yes, I would love it.
The work that I did, the research that I ended up doing really emerged originally from my own life experience. Like so many people, I grew up with a dog who I loved. I also cared about animals like most people, right? I would never want to contribute to them suffering, especially when that suffering was just so intensive and so completely unnecessary. And yet I was eating animals regularly. And it's just like over the course of so many meals, so many years, I never thought about how strange it was that I could be petting my dog with one hand while I ate a pork chop with the other. A pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as intelligent and sentient as my dog. I just didn't make the connection between the meat on my plate and the living being it once was. And then all of that changed in 1989. I was 23 years old. It's a long time ago now. And I ate a hamburger that turned out to have been contaminated with a really dangerous bacteria. And I wound up hospitalized on intravenous antibiotics. And I came out of that experience like as a vegetarian, but like I became a vegetarian by accident, essentially. Like, the last thing that you've eaten when you get so violently ill and you have a digestive issue, it's like, you're just like, oh my God, I'm never eating that again. I just got really grossed out by meat. And so I had to learn how to cook for myself and shop for myself. And this was like before the internet, anyway. So all of my searching led me to information on animal agriculture. And then that's when the ball really started to get rolling. Like, what I learned just shocked and horrified me. I couldn't believe the extent of harm to animals. Just in just one day, more farmed animals are slaughtered globally than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. It was just like mind-boggling. I couldn't believe, the harm to the environment, to my own body and public health. And this was back in the 80s before they knew anywhere near what they know today. But what shocked me in some ways, even more, was that nobody I talked to about what I was learning was willing to hear what I had to say, and these were like people like I had been, right? They were compassionate people, cared about animals, progressive people, cared about their impact on the planet and other human beings. But their reaction, as soon as I started sharing with them, like, oh my God, you're not going to believe what's going on here, what I'm learning about, the reaction was always something like, don't tell me that you'll ruin my meal. Or they'd call me a radical vegan. I became vegan in the course of learning about these things, a radical vegan hippie propagandist, right? And it was just like, oh my God. So I became really curious as to how, rational, caring people like I had been, like a couple of months before, could just stop thinking and feeling when it came to this issue of eating animals. I was just like, what is going on here? And this was what led me eventually to do my doctorate in psychology, my PhD. And I studied broadly the psychology of violence and nonviolence. I was like, what compels people who we know are fundamentally good people to nevertheless support global atrocities? Because what I had uncovered was, in my mind, this is a global atrocity. And other global problems, that good people support. What is it that enables people to do this? And what, therefore could help shift this way of thinking so that people could be more authentic in how they relate to others in the world? And I narrowed down the focus for my doctoral dissertation, my research, and I just focused on the psychology of eating animals. And in the process of doing this research, this was what led me to identify Carnism. I was like, oh my God, what I'm seeing here, this is more than just, paradoxical attitudes and behaviors in a handful of people I'm interviewing, like I interviewed butchers, meat cutters, people who raised and killed their own animals for food, meat eaters, and everybody had been just like I had been, right? Just before I became vegan, everybody had the same paradoxical experience. They cared about animals. They cringed at the thought of animal suffering, and yet they actively supported animal agriculture, which is the institution that is responsible for more harm and suffering to animals than all other institutions globally combined. And so I really, really then focused on, okay, what is this system, Carnism, and deconstructed it, and like how does it affect us psychologically? And that's what led me to do my work.
What were the biggest takeaways in diving into this, and why it is so strong, these beliefs, that we don't even recognize them as beliefs, that it like literally rules the way 90+% of the world eats, right? In terms of people who might love animals and eat them.
Right, totally. It's just eating animals. It's just like for most of us, it's just a given. It's just the way things are, the way things always have been, and the way things always will be. And like we all just check our critical thinking at the door when it comes to one of the most impactful and profound choices that we make in our daily lives over and over again. So, and this only happens because we're so deeply indoctrinated to just switch it off, mentally as well as emotionally. And so what I discovered is that there is this system, that I named Carnism. And, Carnism is a special kind of belief system. It is what's called a dominant system. That means that it's so widespread that its beliefs, its teachings are essentially, they're invisible. They're just woven through the structure of society to shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, and so on. And they're embraced and maintained by all of our major social institutions, from medicine to nutrition to government to business to religion to veterinary medicine and so on. Eating animals is just the way things are. It's the way things are supposed to be, right? So when we study nutrition, for example, we actually study carnistic nutrition. And we don't recognize carnistic bias because it's just baked right into the system. We don't recognize it. We only tend to recognize those ways of thinking that fall outside the mainstream. That's why we have labeled vegetarianism, we've labeled veganism. And that's why when somebody does challenge the idea of eating animals or question the idea of eating animals or promote another way, an alternative, veganism, they're often called biased because they're challenging the bias of the dominant culture. So Carnism is a dominant system, and Carnism is also a violent system. It's actually an oppressive system. Carnism runs counter to core human values that the vast majority of us espouse. Values like compassion or caring. Most people would never, ever willingly support the slaughter of trillions of innocent animals, unnecessary slaughter, and the harm to the environment and all of these other problems. And yet most people do support it on a regular basis. And that is because violent systems such as Carnism, oppressive systems such as Carnism, use a set of psychological defense mechanisms. These are ways of thinking, distorted ways of thinking, right? These psychological defense mechanisms distort our perceptions and disconnect us from our natural empathy so that we act against our values, we act against our own interests and better judgment, we act against the interests of others without even realizing that we're doing any of that. And it's really interesting because Carnism it's a global phenomenon. Like a lot of people listening might be thinking like, well, okay, fine, we love dogs here in the West, but what about where they eat dogs in some places in Asia? And it's true, in some places in Asia they eat dogs, and in India they don't eat cows, and in France some people eat horses. Carnism is a global phenomenon. In meat-eating cultures around the world, everybody experiences Carnism, just about everybody is indoctrinated by Carnism, right? We all learn, members of all cultures, learn to classify a small handful of species as edible. All the rest they classify as inedible. And members of all cultures tend to view their own choices to be rational and the choices of other cultures to be irrational and disgusting and usually even morally offensive. So even though the type of animal consumed changes from culture to culture, the experience of eating animals remains remarkably consistent. When we're born into a dominant system like Carnism, we absorb that system's logic as our own. We look at the world through the lens of Carnism. And because Carnism is so counter to the way that most people operate and want to be in the world, it really depends on using these psychological defense mechanisms that distort the way that we think and see and numbing us. It really, really depends on this. Basically, these defense mechanisms, they become internalized, and Carnism conditions us to feel defensive against anyone or anything that would get us out of the carnistic box.
Talk about the defense mechanisms.
Okay, so Carnism teaches us to see farmed animals as abstractions. The name of this defense doesn't really matter, de-individualization. Like, nobody needs to know that, right? But this is the way it operates. It causes us to think for example, that a pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. So while we recognize that our dogs or our cats or horses or ourselves, other animals have personalities, characteristics, individuality, we learn to think of farmed animals as abstractions. A pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. This is a distancing mechanism. It makes it easier for us to eat pigs when we don't think of pigs as beings and we think of them as these abstractions. Carnism also teaches us to think of farmed animals as objects. So we refer to the chicken on our plate as something rather than someone. And Carnism uses a set of myths. Carnism uses one defense is justification, right? And the way that we learn to justify eating animals is by learning to believe that the myths of eating animals are the facts of eating animals. And, there's a vast mythology surrounding eating animals, but they all fall under what I refer to as the 3 N's of justification. We learn to believe that eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And of course, these same arguments have been used to justify violent practices throughout human history, from heterosexual supremacy to male dominance. And these are myths that we have treated as fact. Like, most people do not realize that these ideas are nothing other than a set of widely held opinions that, when scrutinized, don't stand up.
Is it awareness that people who snap out of this, is that what snaps them out? Is just a mass awareness? Like, everyone's kind of living in this belief system with all these myths that are real as real can feel, right? For the people who don't stay in it and become vegan or kind of step outside of it, what is it that makes some people do that and most people not?
I mean, that's a really good question. That's the $1 million question, right? And the short answer is, I don't know, that there isn't one definitive thing that happens. There are sort of a set of circumstances that need to be in place. One is that a person needs to feel safe enough to see reality for what it is. A lot of people turn away from the reality of carnism, particularly sensitive people, actually. I wrote an article last year called How Sensitive People Can Help End Violence Without Getting Hurt. So a lot of people who are attracted to animal protection and other issues, human protection, environmental support, and climate change advocacy, what's the word I'm looking for? Climate advocacy, are sensitive people, who care very, very much. But anyway, many people who are sensitive people would normally be supporting something like veganism or animal protection in some way, and yet are afraid to even start to open themselves up to the reality because they're terrified that they're going to get flooded by it. Even people who aren't highly sensitive can easily feel this way. So one thing is that people will start to make the change, will start to open themselves up to this reality that we're talking about of animal suffering when they feel safe enough to do that, when they feel like they have enough boundaries to protect themselves so that they don't feel overwhelmed by the information. And frankly, I always tell people, you can very much be a part of the solution without ever having to learn about anything terrible or graphic or watch any of those videos. You don't have to know all of that. So, but anyway, that's one reason. Another reason is because sometimes people are afraid that when they start to realize the problem of carnism, they're going to have to make a hard choice. And that's going to be, whether to stop eating animals or not. And when you stop eating animals, it can throw a monkey wrench into some aspects of your life, like your communication and your relationships with other people, because carnism conditions people to feel so defensive against veganism in many ways. You see, there's a lot of struggle between vegans and non-vegans in relationships, or one person will become vegan and all of a sudden their communication, their relationship starts to break down, and that can be really hard for them. And I know we'll talk about this a little bit later. And I will say your communication doesn't have to break down and your relationships do not have to end. But for many people who aren't aware of that and who don't have the tools, they can end up struggling in relationships. And people have to be in a position where they can actually make the behavioral change to go along with their newfound awareness about the problems inherent in animal agriculture. I think that one big barrier to change is this idea that people have adopted which is that either you're vegan and you're part of the solution, or you're not vegan and you're part of the problem. So for many people, they're like, I'd rather not even know about the problem, because if you're not ready to be a person who thinks I'm not ready to become fully vegan yet, for whatever reason, maybe they're a single parent raising kids and they just don't have the wherewithal to do it. Maybe they're on a limited budget. Maybe they're like a massive foodie and they're terrified of losing their ability to enjoy themselves the way that they need to. There could be any number of reasons. And many people think, I don't want to feel like a hypocrite, And as soon as I become aware of just how bad it is, or as soon as I say, yeah, I think actually not eating animals, I think carnism is a problem and I think carnism should end. If they believe that means they have to suddenly go vegan, otherwise they're a hypocrite, then they're going to block out the information. And so I think it's really important to appreciate two things. One is that you can help end carnism without stopping eating animals entirely. You can become what I call a vegan ally. A vegan ally is a supporter of veganism and vegans, even though they're not fully vegan themselves. And just be as vegan as possible, whatever that means to you. If the whole world were as vegan as possible, if everyone in the world were as vegan as possible, the world would be vegan pretty quickly.
I have a 10-year-old nephew who called me, who has a vegetarian mom and a very heavy meat-eating dad. Like, he eats a lot of meat. And last summer, my nephew called me. They live in Europe. And he FaceTimed me and said, Beth, I really want to go vegan right now, because he had just witnessed some horrible meal being served. And I thought, okay, this is going to last 4 days because he doesn't have support, and there's going to be a cake at a birthday party, and then it's going to all go away. So I said to him, let's start vegetarian. And he's still vegetarian, and that was July. And he's very proud. I think he will be vegan. But there is a thing about support, right? Like,
totally.
I'm not just talking about kids. I'm talking about adults. I'm talking about, it's a scary thing to enter something where society isn't there. I've been watching his whole experience, like other kids, like when society isn't there and you step in and you're saying, I'm different. And a lot of people read that as, oh, they think they're better, right? There's so much weird stuff around it that I do like what you're saying is there's so much fear, not even about what you're eating or not eating, but of just who you're saying you are or aren't.
So true. Yeah, that's so well said. And you're 1,000% right. With this, there's an identity, your identity comes into question. And all of a sudden people are like, oh my God, I'm not just quote unquote normal, just like everybody else. I'm not part of the mainstream anymore. And there's a lot of fear around changes in identity, loss of identity, and also, to your point, social support. I mean, they've done studies on this, and they found that, I think if it's not the number one, it's one of the top reasons, but I think it's a top reason for people to stop being vegan is because they don't have the social support they need. They feel they need more community. They feel too isolated. And I think that the isolation would be less of a problem if they had vegan allies in their lives, right? If they had people who were not teasing them, or, they weren't experiencing carnistic prejudice the way so many vegans do. And, to be fair, there are plenty of people who are not teasing vegans and who truly are allies. But you are making really, really important points, which is, I think, a big barrier. I think we know a big barrier to people making the change and taking in more information that would help them make that change, even changing to vegan, becoming vegan, or even becoming more vegan in some ways, is this fear of what that means socially.
And it feels like, and you know this because you've been playing the long game here, you've been doing this a very long time. It feels like it would be easier now because there's been more acceptance of vegans, vegan restaurants, vegan food, all of that. But has that changed in terms of vegan allies and society being more okay with vegans?
I mean, it depends on where you are in the world. My experience is that, as I've said, I've been vegetarian since 89 and vegan since probably 89 or 90. And I've seen a lot of change since then. And certainly in the past 10 years, tremendous change. I've been traveling a lot. I've been to 50 or so countries and talked with people in positions of leadership in the vegan space all over the world, and people and, reporters who are writing about quote unquote food trends and animal issues all around the world. And what I've seen consistently is that support for veganism is growing like tremendously. And I remember when I went vegan, like it was like there's tofu and like some macrobiotic stuff and like very chalky, milky soy milk. And that was about it. And now it's like the name is, the term is known in many places, the Middle East and Asia and South America, here in Europe and certainly in the United States. So it has really, really flourished. It's also true that there's been a backlash in the past couple of years, as I'm sure you're aware that the numbers, it looks like there's some increase in meat consumption. There certainly is more of a negative perception of veganism than I think there had been before the past 2 years. There's been a backlash between all progressive movements. I think this is the anti-vegan backlash is part of a much broader backlash as the world sort of shifts politically and becomes more conservative and reactive in its thinking. But it doesn't worry me a lot because that's sort of just the way social change happens. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I think that I'm trying to think of a non-carnistic or non-speciesist expression. I was going to say the horse has left the gate, but that's not really the right way to say it. But you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, and it's not linear, right? It's going to go up, down,
exactly.
But hopefully up the whole time. Yeah. Because you talk to so many groups of people in big rooms and big all over the world, when you explain Carnism and that this is actually a belief system to a large group of people or individual people, is there sort of an awakening? I mean, awakening is a big word for like, I don't think the whole room probably wakes up and goes vegan, but do people respond like, oh, I never thought about it that way? Like it all makes more sense now kind of thing?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, to be fair, people are self-selected. If they're listening to me talk, it means they're curious about the psychology of eating animals. Yeah. A lot of the way that I'm working, my organization Beyond Carnism, we're working to raise awareness is through short videos that we have on the topic. And generally what I hear is, people say, oh my God, I never thought of, oh yeah, I get it. Because what I'm talking about is something that everybody who's listening has already lived. I'm not telling them anything new. I'm giving words to an existing lived experience. Most people have what the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton refers to as a knowing without knowing. On one level, we know that animals suffer and die under animal agriculture. We know that we care about animals, and this is like not in alignment with who we want to be in the world. We know it, but we prefer not to know it. We know that hamburger is the body of a dead animal, which is like really gross when you think about it. And we've just learned to override that disgust reaction. So for many people, my experience is that people are like, oh, yeah, aha. You just actually gave me a name for something that I've been living and experiencing my entire life, but I never named. And now that I name it, I can see it. And now that I can see it, I can question it and I can think about it differently. And talking about Carnism, and I don't even think we have to use the term if we don't want to, but talking about even just the psychology of eating animals and how we're conditioned. So, for some people, I don't even bother using the term because it can be too abstract for them or a distraction and it's not necessary. But simply to be like, oh yeah, I've learned to disconnect. I've learned to see this animal as food and this animal is not food. It gives people an opportunity to question their choices without feeling blamed and shamed, because it's not like you're a bad person. And this is like one of the really wonderful things about identifying social systems, like these harmful social systems like carnism or patriarchy or racism or whatever. It's not saying that supporting those systems isn't a problem. It clearly is. But it helps us understand how people are the products of systems. So when we look at carnism, instead of somebody feeling like I'm a bad person because I eat animals, they can think, which is more realistic, oh, I've been conditioned to think and feel a certain way, deeply conditioned. And the problem is actually the system. And I'm part of that system. Ideally, we want them to try to step out of the system. But I think, the first step is helping people to just identify it and also to see the defenses for what they are. Because once we see carnistic defenses, they lose some of their power.
When you said earlier in the conversation, you said when you first went vegan and then you found out all this information about the atrocities and horrors of factory farming and what's happening in the world, and you wanted to tell everybody you knew, and you knew right then they would go vegan too. I think every person who's ever gone vegan has had that experience. Most people, right? And I think when you then go to your friends or your family and say, "Oh my God, this is happening," what comes back at you feels like this horrible resistance. Like, I would never do that. But it's what you're saying, even when like vegans and people who don't participate in that system understand carnism, it also makes them or me or realize it's not resistance that's coming back at you. It looks like resistance, but it's not coming from like, oh, I hate vegans and I hate vegetables.
Yeah.
It's coming from like, no, I don't even see it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like so it takes all the angst out of it.
Yeah. It is resistance, but it's not personal. Right? They're resisting the information, but they're not resisting you. So we made a video called What to Say to Vegans. And this is an 8-minute video for anybody who is vegan or is vegan allied or aligned, I guess I'd say, and who wants the people in their lives to understand them better. Because a lot of times what happens is, what you're describing, right? So somebody becomes vegan, and I have heard this over and over and over again. It's what ultimately led me to write my book, Beyond Beliefs, which is the guide to communicating and, relationships between vegans and non-vegans. Many people will say like, okay, so becoming vegan was like one of the most, inspiring, empowering choices that they've made in their lives. And yet that sense of empowerment, inspiration quickly turns to shock and horror when they discover that their relationships and communication are breaking down. And it's like, wait a minute, I thought, like I had thought, like, hey guys, guess what I learned? Of course you're going to want to know this, And instead it's like just shutting you down, blaming you for like ruining the mood. And it's very painful for vegans. And it also is painful for the people in relationships with vegans who then, end up feeling really disconnected. And what many vegans find is that they start to feel invisible in some of their most important relationships. There's a pain, we know research has shown that we are humans and some other animals are hardwired to seek meaningful connections with others. And we're hardwired to avoid the pain of disconnection. And probably everybody listening to this knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's really painful to be with somebody, especially somebody you care about, who you feel or felt close to, and to feel that disconnect. How can I find you again, right? And we feel when we become vegan, often we start to feel disconnected from the people in our lives that we were once close to because we feel invisible to them. It's like what hurts us, like the heartbreak of realizing what's happening in the world, the fire in your belly of wanting to shout it from the rooftops and just make the bloodshed end, the trauma of witnessing what we've witnessed, all of that is invisible to the people in our lives. And instead, they're seeing us as these anti-human, militant, overly sentimental, animal-loving, weirdos. Weirdos. And that's really painful. And so what many vegans do, which is totally understandable, is they try to reconnect. They're seeking connection, right? And they think to themselves, well, the problem is just that you're not vegan. So if I can get you to go vegan, then everything will be fine and we'll find our way together again. And what really, obviously the other person becoming vegan would be a gift, a boon. Underneath that, however, the deeper drive is often to restore the connection. And so in an attempt to restore the connection, the vegan will be like, okay, well, you need to go vegan. And of course, as soon as the vegan is pushing for veganism, the other person gets more resistant because they feel more pushed. And there are all these negative stereotypes of vegans floating around, and suddenly the vegan is confirming all of them. They're suddenly overly emotional because they're freaking out because the people they love are putting the bodies of dead animals into their mouths and acting like nothing's wrong and blaming the vegan for caring about what they would care about too if they knew better. And the non-vegan is getting increasingly defensive and pushing back and judging the vegan. And the vegan is saying then like, oh my God, look, maybe they forced the person to watch some horrible graphic video, and then the next day their partner or whoever it is at the McDonald's drive-through, and the vegan is thinking, oh my God, who have I married? Who are you? How can you do this? How can I feel connected with somebody I can't even respect? And on it goes. And so this video that we made, What to Say to Vegans, is what the world, it's an 8-minute video of what the world looks like through vegan eyes. And many vegans many vegans discover that they don't need the other person to be vegan in order for that reconnection to be established. They just need the other person to be a vegan ally. We need everybody in a relationship of any degree of closeness needs to know that the other person sees who they are and values who they are. We need to know that our inner worlds are seen, whatever that may mean. And so I always recommend to vegans who are struggling in a relationship, instead of saying to your partner, whoever it is, I need you to go vegan and trying to get them to become vegan, which generally backfires. Relationships are not forums for advocacy. Ask them to be an ally to you and say to them, I really, really want to share information about veganism with you. Not to turn you vegan, but so that you understand me. Because if you don't really know what makes my heart sing and what breaks my heart, you're not going to understand me on the level I need you to. And you're probably going to offend me even when you don't mean to. And so you invite somebody into your world by helping them to understand veganism without, by the way, showing them lots of graphic imagery or something. And this often helps. And then when the person becomes an ally and it's like, okay, maybe for whatever reason, I don't feel like I can be fully vegan just yet, but thank you for caring so much. Thank you for trying to help the animals of this world. I get it now. I get why you care so much and what you're doing.
And I would imagine then it's a much better relationship after that. Because I've been thinking, as you were speaking, I was thinking, I have a lot of friends who are not vegan, who are vegan allies. They want to go to vegan restaurants with me. The majority of the time I see them, they'll eat vegan. It's New York. Mm-hmm. It's not that hard to get people to go out and eat vegan. And it makes a huge difference, the vegan allies. It's a big game changer. Talk a little more about relationships. Get into a little bit what you talk about as relational dysfunction, humans and how humans interact and how humans can actually really change how they are in relationship with one another. Stuff that maybe we should have learned many years before.
Imagine what the world would be like if we had.
Yeah, we should have grown up learning.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I always say this, that most of us have to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use, and we don't get a single formal lesson in how to be healthy relational beings. And when you look at the problems facing the world today, problems in the world and in our personal lives, these are not problems that are caused by people who don't know how to do geometry. So when after I wrote Why We Love Dogs, Hate Pigs, and Wear Cows, I went on and did more research, and I really I expanded that theory of Carnism to really, what I had done was I had taken the system of Carnism and deconstructed it and asked, how is it? It's structured like other systems, patriarchy, racism, and so on. And my question was not just what is the system, but how is it structured? What keeps it intact? And that was what led me to identify these defense mechanisms. And the various ways that society and most importantly, psychologically, that we keep the system alive. And then I extended that to other similarly structured systems. And, if you look at these systems, the experience of each set of victims will always be unique. I don't ever want to compare the experience of the victims of the systems, but the systems are structurally similar. The mentality that drives the violence is the same, whether we're talking about violence toward farmed animals or violence toward non-farmed animals, or violence toward humans, or violence toward the environment. I got to thinking, and my other hat over the years had been as a relationship coach. It's something I've always been fascinated by, very interested in relationships. I'm a psychologist. And so, I realized that, when we think of some of the most pressing problems in our world, right? War, poverty, animal exploitation, climate change, as again, racism and patriarchy and all of these, like some of the major problems facing our world and also in our personal lives, like domestic violence, or even if it's like not physical violence, domestic dysfunction and toxic workplaces and self-harm and so on. We look at all of these issues, we can see that there's a really important common denominator under all of them, driving all of them, and that is relational dysfunction or dysfunctional ways of relating between social groups. When we're talking about patriarchy, for example, or Carnism, or rather patriarchy, I should say, ways of relating between humans, ways of relating between humans and non-human animals. And, we're always relating to ourselves as well, right? For better or worse, through our self-talk and through our choices that impact our future selves. So when we relate in a way that is dysfunctional, that means we are relating in a way that causes harm. Ultimately, it causes us to feel insecure and disconnected, and it also creates unjust power imbalances. If our collective level of relational dysfunction weren't so high, we wouldn't vote for relationally toxic leaders and relationally toxic public policies. We would know better.
How does someone recognize relational dysfunction? It sounds very obvious, but if it was that obvious, people wouldn't be so mired in it.
Exactly.
It wouldn't be running the world.
Exactly. It's for many people, it's really an abstraction, right? And it's a feeling. It's like we all know what it feels like to be in a relationally dysfunctional interaction. It's you're interacting with somebody and maybe it seems fine on the outside, but you just feel a little bit less than. You feel a little bit maybe triggered. You feel a little bit contracted in yourself. Everybody listening knows what I'm talking about. And I'll specify exactly the behaviors, right? And we also know what it feels like to be in a relationally healthy interaction where it's easier for you to be your better self. You're interacting with somebody, and it's like, wow, I don't have to work to not be pissed off and to not be triggered or whatever. I feel like I can be my better self. So I describe, in looking at the literature when I was working on my books, I wrote, as I said, 2 books on relationships. One is Beyond Beliefs, and the other one is called Getting Relationships Right. It's a one-stop guide to building relational literacy. Really did a deep dive for a long, long time post, my first deep dive into all of the relationship literature and really, identified how in a healthy interaction, or a healthy relationship. A relationship is just a series of interactions. It's the same thing. So in a healthy interaction, we practice integrity and honor the other person's or individual's dignity. So let me break this down even further. When we practice integrity, our integrity is our core moral, our integrity are our moral values. And research has shown that, there are some universal moral values that are most widely espoused, and caring or compassion is one of them. Fairness or justice is the other, right? So when we practice integrity, we basically are acting with caring. We're acting compassionately, right? We're practicing compassion and treating the other person the way that we would want to be treated if we were in their position. So that's practicing integrity. We can simplify it by saying treating the other person with compassion or the way we would want to be treated. When we honor somebody's dignity, this is an attitude. And then we act on the behavior. So your dignity is your sense of inherent worth or value. When we feel a sense of dignity, this means we feel like we are fundamentally worthy beings. We are no less worthy of being treated with compassion, of occupying space on this planet than anybody else. We're all equally worthy of being treated with compassion. So when we practice integrity and honor dignity, that is, I call this the formula for healthy relating, right? It's the foundation of building relational literacy. This leads to a sense of security and connection, and to a sense of balanced power. So if you think about a healthy relationship that you have, chances are you trust that that other person practices integrity toward you, that they treat you the way they would want to be treated if they were in your position. You feel like they're using compassion, practicing compassion. You probably feel like they honor your dignity. They see you as not less than they are. You're not inferior to them on some moral level. You're just as valuable a being as they or anybody else is. And you probably feel secure with them in that relationship. You probably feel a sense of connection with them. relational dysfunction is the opposite, right? And when we act in a way that's relationally dysfunctional, we violate our integrity. We act against our values. We're not practicing compassion. We're not treating the other person the way we would want to be treated. We harm their dignity. We're perceiving them as less worthy of being treated with this kindness and compassion. And we therefore create a sense of insecurity and disconnection. And like most things in life, this formula for healthy relating, it's not either or. It's not either an interaction is healthy or unhealthy. It's more or less so. So if you think about, your experiences, you can say, oh, yeah, in this experience, yeah, it felt pretty healthy. I felt pretty secure and connected, and vice versa. The beautiful thing about the formula is that we can just come back to it at any moment during the day. And it applies to every kind of interaction, including our interactions with ourselves. Most of us don't practice the formula toward ourselves. We shame ourselves. We harm ourselves. We harm our own dignity by thinking, oh my God, I screwed up so badly. I don't deserve this, whatever. So this is really the foundation of building relational literacy and healthy relating.
I mean, but mostly is it first, you got to love yourself?
I'm glad you asked that. This is a little pet peeve of mine. I think that this idea that you have to love yourself before you can love others is something that, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years ago or whenever it came out, sounded really good and profound, and everybody loved it and just kept on using it without actually thinking if it was true. I don't know. I don't believe it to be true. Many people can attest that they learn to love themselves through loving and being loved by others. There are plenty of people who learn what love is when they have their first child, or when they fall in love for the first time. The thing about building relational literacy, building your relational skills, right, is that it's like your relational literacy, it's like a muscle that grows with use. So it doesn't really matter when you're practicing relational literacy. Well, when you're practicing the formula, right? Whether you're practicing it to yourself or you're practicing it to your neighbor, every time you practice it, your relational muscle grows. So for some people, it's just easier to practice the formula toward others and not themselves. But then they learn through treating others well, how to treat themselves better.
Right. And if you take that in a bigger, broader way, not just one person to one person, but for example, if you look at the animal rights movement, right, you take a whole movement of people, because it's got such the way we as a movement have kind of grown and evolved in the world, and I do think it's getting better, but it has a lot of the relational dysfunction, right? If you look at, in part probably because of how individually a lot of people were treated, right? And still are, and the movement is treated. But it just made me think about how that could really shift and change and be so much more inclusive if there was a lot more of the integrity, dignity thing going back and forth.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the thing. We're all humans, and humans are, we've all been born into a relationally dysfunctional mess of the world. Most of us have learned how to relate from watching our parents or caregivers, not great role models, Hollywood, even worse, probably, government, also not good, so most of us just kind of stumble through our relational lives, kind of figuring it out as we go along, and, burning and getting burned in the process. And that's just the nature. I mean, it's just the nature of what we've been born into. And fortunately, there's, more awareness today. There's more work being done to raise awareness and to help people build their relational skills. It's one of the focuses of my organization, Beyond Carnism. To your point, it's very true that people, in social movements, groups, right? These groups that are working to end relational dysfunction, actually, to end harm, to end the isms, are themselves plagued by relational dysfunction. We've got infighting in groups for progressive change, and the infighting is an example of the very dysfunction we're trying to change. And this is why it's so important to really look at social injustice and justice through a relational lens, because it's not enough to just understand who is oppressing or abusing whom. We need to understand how and why we oppress and abuse in the first place. Otherwise we're just going to keep recreating oppression in new forms. So if we want to create a better world, ultimately we have to change the way we relate. And, when we learn how to relate more skillfully, our groups for progressive change get a lot stronger and a lot more resilient because we don't have this toxicity, this toxic infighting and other problems.
On a totally different subject, you have a new book, your first fiction book. First of all, what brought this on?
Where did this come from?
Yes.
I had always done creative writing. It was the form of writing I actually enjoyed. And I always wanted to write a novel. And I finally got to a point in my life where I felt like with the nonfiction, I had said what I needed to say. And I wanted another way to talk about the issues that I'm talking about in nonfiction, but that's more enjoyable and entertaining. The book is not, some advocacy tool, of course, but it does have the same themes that are woven through my other work.
It's called The Half-Hearted Death Wish. Just talk a little bit about what it is.
So it's a little bit of a strange book, actually. It's about a psychologist who is in excellent mental health, who wakes up one day to discover that her will to live has been replaced by a burning desire to be dead. And she has no idea where this came from because she's not depressed and she's not anxious and she doesn't actually have any major life problems. She just wants to be dead. And so the story is really about her journey of discovery. And it's a mystery and it's also a humor book. I know it sounds strange that this is humorous, but that's the way it would be classified.
Melanie, thank you. It's so good to have you back.
Thank you.
It's so good to see you.
Great. Oh, it's such a pleasure.
To learn more about Melanie and to find her books, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polky-Link, Hannah Gabrielson, and Anna Kolner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.